Jake had always been proud of the house he had worked hard to buy. It wasn't just a place to live. It was a symbol of everything he had achieved. For years, he had saved up, sacrificed, and put in the hours to get the property he wanted. His dream had always been to own a house, a place he could call his own, a place where he could build a future. Every corner of the house held memories. He had renovated it with his own hands, turning it into a home. Jake loved the neighborhood he lived in. It was quiet, with wide streets lined with trees and well-kept lawns. People looked out for each other, and there was a sense of community. The HOA, Homeowners Association, was there to ensure the neighborhood stayed clean and orderly, which suited Jake just fine. He wasn't one to break the rules or cause trouble, and he respected the HOA's role in maintaining the peace. He liked that everything in the neighborhood was orderly, and he appreciated the effort everyone put into making it a nice place to live. But one evening, while Jake was on a business trip, he received an alarming call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was familiar, but the news was anything but. "Jake, you need to know something," his neighbor, Tim, said. "Karen, the new HOA president, she's been making some strange demands about your house." Jake frowned, confusion spreading through him. "What do you mean, strange demands?" "Karen's claiming that your house violates some neighborhood codes, things that have never been a problem before," Tim explained. "She's been sending out notices, and now she's spreading rumors that your house is in violation of the HOA rules." Jake felt a wave of frustration building inside him. "I know my house is in perfect condition. I've been through all the codes when I bought it, and everything is up to standard. What is she talking about?" Tim hesitated before speaking again. "She's saying you've made some changes that go against the HOA guidelines. She's been telling people that you might have to sell or make repairs to keep the neighborhood from losing value. But honestly, I don't think anyone is buying it. The whole thing seems off." Jake sat back in his hotel room, his mind racing. He had worked hard to buy this house, and now, some new HOA president was making up stories to cause trouble? The more he thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. He knew the house was fine. He had done everything by the book. What was Karen's game? "I don't know, Tim. This doesn't make sense. I'll be home soon, and I'll sort this out. Thanks for letting me know." As soon as Jake hung up, he felt a tight knot in his stomach. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. There was something deeper going on here, something Jake didn't yet understand. He had dealt with HOAs before, people who followed the rules and made sure things ran smoothly. But Karen? She didn't seem like the type to make a simple mistake. The next day, Jake returned home early. As he pulled into the driveway of his house, the familiar comfort of home hit him. The morning sunlight filtered through the trees, casting shadows over the front lawn. Everything looked perfect. His house was just as he remembered it, well-maintained and exactly how he had left it. But something felt off. There was a new energy in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. He noticed Karen's car parked across the street, and sure enough, there she was, standing near his front gate, watching him with a critical eye. Her posture was stiff, and there was something about the way she stood that made Jake uneasy. Jake walked toward her, trying to keep his voice calm. "Karen, I heard you've been making some claims about my house. Is there something wrong?" Karen smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Jake, I've been sent by the HOA to inform you that your property has several violations of neighborhood codes." She paused, as if waiting for him to react. "I'm sure you weren't aware, but that's the role of the HOA president, to make sure everyone is following the rules." Jake's frustration flared. "I'm very aware of the rules, Karen. I followed them to the letter when I bought the house. What violations are you talking about?" "Well, for one, there's the matter of the fence you put up in the backyard," Karen said, her tone sharp. "It's not the approved height. And your driveway, it doesn't match the neighborhood's aesthetic. You've made alterations without getting approval from the HOA first." Jake shook his head. "Karen, that fence has been there for years, and it's within the guidelines. I've never received any complaints about it. As for the driveway, It's just a simple repair I did to improve the property. There's nothing out of the ordinary." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Well, the HOA doesn't see it that way. I've been talking to the neighbors, and they're concerned. Your property is starting to stand out too much. People don't want the neighborhood to lose its value." Jake felt his blood pressure rise. "So now you're trying to tell me that I'm ruining the neighborhood? My house is fine. It's not your job to dictate how I maintain my property. I've followed all the guidelines, and I've never had an issue before." Karen's smile was cold. "Perhaps you should be more careful in the future. I'm just doing my job. The HOA has rules for a reason. We can't have one house throwing everything off balance. If you don't make the necessary changes, the HOA might have to take further action. I'm sure you wouldn't want that, would you?" Jake's fists clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "You're not going to push me around, Karen. I'm not selling, and I'm not making unnecessary changes just because you don't like my property." Karen's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "I think you'll find that the HOA has more influence than you realize, Jake. Maybe it's time you started paying attention to the rules. People have been talking, and I can't promise that everyone will be as lenient as I've been." As she turned to walk back to her car, Jake's frustration turned to something darker, anger mixed with determination. He wasn't going to let Karen, or anyone else for that matter, take his home. It wasn't just a house, it was his future. He had worked too hard to let someone like her come in and destroy what he had built. Little did Karen know, she had made a terrible mistake. Jake wasn't like the other homeowners who had let the HOA bully them into submission. He wasn't going to roll over and accept her demands. He had the power to fight back, and he wasn't about to let her get away with it. As he stood there watching Karen's car drive away, Jake knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Jake stood by his front gate, watching Karen's car drive away. Her last words echoed in his mind, her thinly veiled threats lingering in the air like a bad taste he couldn't shake off. "Maybe it's time you started paying attention to the rules," she had said with a smirk, as if she held all the power. But Jake wasn't the type to back down. No matter how much Karen pushed, he wasn't about to let her take what was rightfully his without a fight. His house wasn't just a structure. It was a testament to his hard work, his dreams, and his family's legacy. And Karen wasn't going to just waltz in and dictate his life. The anger inside him had only grown stronger as he replayed their conversation. Karen wasn't just attacking his house, she was attacking his right to live the way he saw fit. He had already paid for the property, he had worked for every inch of it, and now she was trying to take it away, using petty rules and threats to make him comply. But Jake wasn't about to let her win. Determined to take action, Jake knew he needed to do more than just argue with Karen. The HOA was an organized force, and Karen was at the helm of it. If he wanted to protect his property and ensure this didn't escalate further, he needed to gather more information and create a plan. He couldn't fight this blindly. He had to be smart, strategic. The first step was to do some digging into the HOA's bylaws. Jake had always been a man who appreciated details, and he was well aware that the devil was in the details. He needed to understand what Karen was really doing, what powers the HOA president had, and what legal standing she thought she had in trying to control his property. The next morning, Jake headed to the local library. It wasn't the most exciting place, but it was the perfect spot for some quiet research. He sat down at a desk and pulled out his laptop. The first thing he did was search for the HOA's governing documents. He knew that every homeowners association had rules about property use, building codes, and fines, but what he didn't know was how far Karen had been willing to bend or break those rules to get what she wanted. Hours passed as Jake sifted through pages of rules and regulations. Most of it was boring, technical language that meant little to the average person, but Jake was determined. He wasn't just reading for the sake of reading. He was looking for something, a loophole, a missed regulation, anything that might give him an edge. As he combed through the bylaws, something caught his eye. There was a section detailing the process for property sales, and another section outlining the procedures for disputes with the HOA. Neither section seemed to have been followed correctly in his case. His property had been sold by the HOA without his knowledge or consent, which, according to the rules, was supposed to be impossible unless the property had been abandoned, a claim Jake knew wasn't true. He quickly took screenshots of the relevant sections, feeling a surge of hope. This wasn't just a case of petty rules anymore. This was about blatant misconduct. Jake wasn't going to let Karen's abuse of power slide, and now he had the proof to back up his fight. Later that afternoon, Jake met with Frank, his lawyer, at a small coffee shop near the courthouse. Frank had been a trusted ally of Jake's for years, and Jake knew he could count on him to help navigate the legal side of things. "Frank, I've got something," Jake said as soon as he sat down, pulling out his phone and showing Frank the screenshots he had taken. "I think Karen's been breaking the rules. She sold my property without my consent, and it looks like the HOA bypassed the entire process. I need to know if this can be used in court." Frank leaned forward, carefully studying the documents. He didn't say anything at first, just nodding as he processed the information. After a moment, he looked up at Jake. "This is solid. If Karen sold your property without your permission and didn't follow the HOA's own procedures, that's a serious issue. You have grounds for a lawsuit, Jake. But we need to act fast. The longer this drags on, the harder it will be to get your property back." Jake's pulse quickened. This was the opening he needed. He wasn't just going to let Karen get away with this. He had worked too hard to make his house a home to watch someone like Karen rip it from his hands. "What's the next step?" Jake asked, his voice steady but full of determination. "We need to gather more evidence," Frank replied. "And we'll need to put together a formal complaint. I'll draft the paperwork, but you need to find witnesses, people who've seen Karen's behavior or have had similar issues with the HOA. We need a paper trail, something solid to show that this isn't just a personal vendetta. This is bigger than that. Karen has been using her position to manipulate homeowners, and it's time to expose that." Jake nodded, already thinking about who he could talk to. There were a few neighbors who had mentioned having issues with the HOA before, and he was certain that if he reached out to the right people, he could find allies. This was bigger than just his house. If Karen was using her position to bully people in the neighborhood, he needed to make sure everyone knew about it. "I'll talk to everyone I can," Jake said. "I'll find the witnesses we need. But I'm not stopping until I get my property back." Frank smiled, a glint of approval in his eyes. "That's the spirit, Jake. We'll get there. But we have to stay ahead of Karen. She's not going to just roll over. She'll try to fight back, and she'll use everything she's got. We need to be prepared." Over the next few days, Jake made it his mission to talk to as many neighbors as possible. He knew that people were scared to speak up against Karen, but he had a way of getting people to open up. He visited every house on his street, knocking on doors and asking questions. Most of the neighbors were friendly and willing to talk, but they all shared a common fear: the HOA's power. Karen had managed to control the neighborhood with intimidation, and anyone who spoke out against her risked fines, legal trouble, or worse. But Jake wasn't going to let that stop him. He found a few neighbors who were willing to testify about their experiences with Karen. One neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, had been fined multiple times for trivial things, like a tree branch hanging over the sidewalk. Another neighbor, Mr. Wells, had been harassed by Karen after he had refused to sell his property to a developer she was working with. Jake knew that these stories, combined with the evidence he had gathered, would be enough to show that Karen wasn't just overstepping her boundaries, she was breaking the law. As the days passed, the pressure on Jake grew. He knew Karen would retaliate, and he was ready for it. The HOA had made a huge mistake, and now Jake was going to make them pay for it. With Frank's help and the support of his neighbors, he was ready to take this fight to the next level. But even as he prepared to take legal action, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. Karen wasn't just trying to take his house. She was trying to control everything, to shape the neighborhood into her own vision of what it should be. And Jake wasn't about to let her get away with it. Jake had always believed in the power of justice. He'd seen it firsthand during his time in the military, how law and order could bring structure to a world of chaos. But now, as he stood in Frank's office, preparing to take on the HOA and Karen, He realized just how complicated it could be to navigate a system meant to protect you, but instead had been corrupted. With Frank by his side, Jake began to understand the full scope of the battle ahead. The HOA wasn't just a simple organization. It was a powerful, well-funded entity with connections throughout the neighborhood and beyond. Karen, as president, held a tight grip on the HOA's operations, and it wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about controlling the community, using fear and manipulation to maintain her power. Jake had to tear down that power, piece by piece. Frank was already working on drafting a complaint, but Jake knew this wouldn't be a straightforward legal battle. The HOA had an entire legal team at their disposal, and Karen wasn't going to sit idly by while Jake tried to take her down. She had the resources to fight back, but Jake had something she didn't. He had the truth, and the truth was a powerful weapon. He wasn't about to back down. "I've been through the bylaws again," Frank said, adjusting his glasses as he scanned through the legal documents. "And honestly, this isn't just a case of property rights. What Karen and the HOA have done goes much deeper. This isn't just about your house. This is about a pattern of abuse. They've been manipulating people for years." Jake leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "I've heard rumors about Karen's tactics. I know she's been pushing people around, but I didn't realize how bad it was. How far are we willing to take this, Frank?" Frank closed the document and looked Jake in the eye. "We take it as far as it needs to go. The fact is, Karen has been using her power to manipulate homeowners, intimidate them into selling properties, and control the neighborhood. That's not just bad for the community, it's illegal. We can make a solid case here. And once we do, the whole neighborhood will see what she's been up to." Jake nodded, his mind racing with the possibilities. The thought of exposing Karen's actions was satisfying, but the reality was daunting. He had to convince not just the court, but the entire neighborhood that Karen wasn't the protector she portrayed herself to be. She was a bully, using her position to line her pockets while causing harm to others. Frank continued, "We've got witnesses, we've got documents, and we've got the evidence of Karen's wrongdoing. But here's the thing, Jake. This won't be easy. Karen's not going to just roll over. She'll use every trick in the book to win. That means we'll need to be strategic, showing the court that her actions are part of a larger scheme to control the community." Jake's anger flared again as he thought about Karen's smug attitude. She had used her power to scare people into submission, and now it was his turn to turn the tables. "I'm not going to let her get away with this, Frank. I've worked my whole life for this house, and I'm not going to let some greedy HOA president take it from me. I'll fight until the end." Frank gave him an encouraging smile. "That's the spirit. But remember, we've got to be patient. It's going to be a long road, and it won't be easy. We have to play it smart." Jake wasn't sure what that would look like, but he trusted Frank. They had a solid plan, and he had faith that the truth would win in the end. As Jake left the law office that day, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the upcoming battle settle heavily on his shoulders. This was more than just a legal dispute. It was about reclaiming his family's legacy. Every inch of that land meant something to him. It was the place where his father had taught him everything he knew about hard work, responsibility, and sacrifice. Jake wasn't going to let Karen tear that down. In the coming days, Jake spent his time reaching out to the neighbors who had expressed concerns about the HOA. He needed witnesses, people who could testify about Karen's tactics and her role in selling properties without permission. He spoke to Mr. Johnson, an elderly neighbor who had lived in the neighborhood for years. Mr. Johnson had seen the changes over time, how the HOA had grown more aggressive under Karen's leadership. He agreed to testify, but his words were laced with caution. "I'm not the type to cause trouble," Mr. Johnson had said. "But what she's done to you, Jake, is wrong. It's not just your property. She's hurt a lot of people. I've seen her threaten homeowners, use their fear to get what she wants. She's used her position to profit, and that's not right." Jake nodded, feeling the anger welling up inside him again. But this time, he channeled it into determination. The more he heard about Karen's actions, the more he knew this fight was bigger than his house. It was about taking down a corrupt system that had controlled the neighborhood for far too long. With Frank's legal expertise and the support of his neighbors, Jake started building a case that could bring Karen and the HOA down. But Jake knew it wasn't just about winning in court. He needed to expose the HOA's corruption to the entire community. If Karen was going to lose, it couldn't just be a legal defeat. It had to be public. The neighborhood had to know the truth about who she really was. As Jake spent the following weeks gathering information, preparing his case, and meeting with more neighbors, Karen's attitude shifted. She started calling more meetings, sending out more threatening letters, and trying to intimidate the community into staying silent. It only fueled Jake's resolve. He knew that Karen was worried. She could feel the pressure mounting, and she was starting to lash out. But Jake wasn't worried. He had the law on his side, and the more he learned about Karen's schemes, the clearer it became that she was the one who had been in the wrong all along. The pressure was building, and Jake was ready to bring it all to a head. The next phase of the battle was clear. Jake was going to take this to the public. He would expose Karen's manipulation, her lies, and her abuse of power. The community had to know what she had been doing, and Jake was going to make sure of it. The HOA might have thought they could take his house, but now it was time for Jake to take back everything he had worked for, and then some. The courtroom was one battleground, but Jake knew that the real fight wasn't just going to be won with legal documents and witness testimony. As Frank had repeatedly reminded him, Karen's power was rooted in fear. The more people she could intimidate, the stronger her grip on the HOA would remain. But Jake wasn't going to just win in the courtroom. He was going to make sure the whole neighborhood saw the truth. The public needed to know exactly what Karen had been up to, and it was time to turn the tables. Jake didn't waste any time. He knew that Karen's influence over the community was one of her strongest weapons. She had controlled people through intimidation, keeping them silent out of fear that they might face fines or lose their homes. But it was clear that the more people spoke out, the less power Karen had. The truth could no longer be hidden. It was time to make her pay, not just with legal consequences, but with the one thing she cared about most, her reputation. Frank had already made several calls to local news outlets, and the reporters were eager to cover the growing scandal. The story had already gained some traction after the initial legal filings, but now Jake and Frank were about to take it to the next level. This wasn't just about winning a court case anymore. This was about exposing Karen and the HOA's corruption to everyone. The neighborhood had to wake up to the reality of what had been happening behind closed doors. The plan was set. Jake contacted the local TV station, and a reporter agreed to come out and do a full story on the corruption within the HOA. Jake wasn't just going to sit back and let them tell the story. He needed to make sure the facts were presented clearly and powerfully. He wanted the community to know that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been affected by Karen's reign. The more people saw what Karen had been doing, the more support Jake would have. The reporter arrived at Jake's house the next day, along with a cameraman. Jake could feel the nerves starting to creep in. Speaking on camera wasn't something he was used to, but he knew it was necessary. This was the moment that would shape the rest of the battle. He had one chance to make sure the truth was heard loud and clear. "Jake, we're here to cover your story," the reporter said, adjusting her microphone. "We've heard a lot about what's been happening with the HOA, and people are starting to take notice. What would you like to tell the community?" Jake took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this wasn't just about him. This was about standing up to the system that had been used to manipulate and control the neighborhood for so long. Karen and the HOA have been taking advantage of people in this community for years. Jake began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm not the only one who's been wronged. The way they've manipulated the rules, forced people to sell their property, and used fear to control this neighborhood, it's all wrong. And it's time for it to stop." The reporter nodded, encouraging Jake to continue. "Tell us more about what happened, Jake. How has this affected you?" Jake looked straight into the camera, speaking directly to the viewers at home. "This is my family's land," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've worked my whole life to get here, to make this a home. And now, Karen and the HOA have tried to take it from me. I served my country, and when I came back, I found out that my land had been sold out from under me. Not because of any real legal issue, but because Karen wanted to line her pockets. She's used her position for personal gain, and that's not something I'm going to let slide." As Jake spoke, he could feel the power of his words. This wasn't just a man fighting for his property. It was a man fighting for justice. And he wasn't going to stop until the truth was out. The reporter then turned to ask more questions, digging into the specifics of Jake's case. But it wasn't just the legal documents and evidence that mattered. It was the personal stories. It was the faces of the people who had been too afraid to speak out, who had suffered at the hands of Karen's manipulation. One by one, neighbors came forward to tell their own stories. "I've had trouble with Karen for years," said Mrs. Thompson, a longtime neighbor who had always kept to herself. "She's been fining me for the smallest things. My grass wasn't cut perfectly, and she tried to hit me with a $500 fine. I had no idea who to turn to. I was scared. But when I heard about Jake's fight, I knew it was time to speak up." Mrs. Thompson wasn't the only one. Mr. Wells, another neighbor, stepped forward. "I tried to sell my house, and Karen made it impossible. She told me I had to lower the price or the HOA would take action. It felt like blackmail. She made me feel like I had no choice. I'm glad Jake's standing up. Someone had to do it." As more and more people shared their stories, the truth started to spread. The reporter captured it all, filming the testimonies and adding it to the story. This wasn't just about Jake anymore. It was about a community that had been living in fear, controlled by a corrupt HOA president who used her position for her own gain. The tide was shifting. People were starting to realize that they weren't alone, that they didn't have to live in fear anymore. The news segment aired that evening, and the response was immediate. Neighbors called Jake, expressing their support, thanking him for standing up to the HOA. People who had been too afraid to speak out now saw Jake as a hero, someone who was fighting not just for his own rights, but for the rights of everyone in the community. The story spread quickly on social media, and before long, the entire neighborhood was buzzing about the scandal. Karen's grip on the community was slipping, and she knew it. The following day, Jake received a phone call from Frank, who had been keeping tabs on the case. "Jake, I've been getting calls from people I never expected," Frank said. "The support is growing. The HOA is getting nervous. We have them cornered." Jake smiled, feeling a surge of hope. For the first time, it seemed like the community was finally awake. They had seen the truth, and they weren't going to let Karen get away with her schemes anymore. But Karen wasn't done yet. She quickly called an emergency HOA meeting, trying to regain control. She claimed that Jake was just stirring trouble, that his accusations were false and that the HOA had only been acting in the best interest of the neighborhood. But the community wasn't buying it anymore. The more Karen tried to defend herself, the more she exposed her desperation. As Jake prepared for the next step, he knew the battle wasn't over. But now, for the first time, he had the upper hand. The truth was on his side, the community was behind him, and he wasn't going to stop until Karen and the HOA were held accountable for everything they had done. The fight for his home was far from over, but it had just shifted in his favor. Jake thought that after the explosive media coverage, Karen would crumble under the weight of the truth. But he was wrong. He should have known better. Karen was no ordinary HOA president. She was a master manipulator, and if anyone thought she'd give up without a fight, they were mistaken. Instead of backing down, Karen launched her most aggressive counterattack yet. It started with a flurry of letters from the HOA's legal team, each one more threatening than the last. Jake had expected this, of course. The HOA wasn't going to roll over just because the truth had come to light. They were powerful, organized, and well-funded. But what Jake hadn't anticipated was the sheer personal vendetta Karen would bring into the fight. She wasn't just trying to defend the HOA anymore. She was trying to destroy him. One afternoon, Jake received a letter from the HOA's lawyers that hit him like a ton of bricks. The letter accused him of spreading false information and damaging the HOA's reputation. The HOA, through their legal team, claimed that Jake's public statements were defamation and that he was trying to disrupt the harmony of the neighborhood. The letter demanded that he issue a public apology and retract his statements, or face legal action. Jake felt the anger rise in him once again. Karen wasn't just trying to take his land. She was trying to silence him, to make him look like the villain. It was a classic Karen move. But Jake wasn't about to back down. He had the truth on his side, and he wasn't going to let her scare him into submission. That's the game she wants to play, huh? Jake said to Frank as they sat in the small office, reading over the letter together. She thinks she can intimidate me into backing down, but that's not going to happen. Frank looked up from the letter, his brow furrowed. This is her move, Jake. She's trying to make you feel like you're the one in the wrong. But we know the truth. And we have the evidence to back it up. It's going to be tough, but if she wants to make it personal, then we'll make it personal, too. We'll show her that she's not the only one who can play this game. Jake nodded, his hands clenched into fists. The feeling of betrayal burned in him. He had trusted the HOA, trusted Karen to be a fair leader. But she had abused her power, and now she was trying to crush him for speaking out. He wasn't going to let that happen. He had a plan. Over the next few days, Jake and Frank worked quickly. They were in constant communication with their allies in the neighborhood, gathering more evidence and reaching out to additional witnesses who were willing to testify about Karen's manipulation. The media coverage was still on their side, but Jake knew it wasn't enough just to be on the offensive legally. He had to expose Karen's entire operation, from the inside out. They started digging deeper into Karen's financial history. Jake knew that Karen wasn't just profiting from the sale of his property. She had been using her position to broker illegal deals and line her pockets at the expense of the homeowners. With Frank's help, Jake discovered multiple shady transactions tied to Karen's name, all linked to the HOA's dealings with developers. One night, as Jake and Frank sat at his kitchen table, combing through the documents they had gathered, Jake's eyes lit up. "Look at this," he said, pointing at one of the documents on the screen. "This is what we needed. It's a trail of land deals Karen has been involved in over the years. These deals weren't just about selling property. They were about Karen using the HOA to manipulate homeowners into selling below market value and profiting from the difference." Frank leaned over, examining the document carefully. "This is it, Jake. This is the smoking gun we've been looking for. These deals are illegal, and they go all the way back. If we expose this, Karen's not just going to lose her position in the HOA, she's going to lose everything." Jake's heart raced with excitement. He knew this was the key to turning the tables on Karen. They couldn't just fight her with legal threats. This was bigger than that. They had to expose her for the fraud she was. But they also knew that they couldn't do this alone. They needed the support of the community, and the more Jake thought about it, the more he realized that he had to give the neighbors the courage to stand up for themselves. Karen had been controlling them with fear for too long. If they were going to win this, it was time to rally the community in full force. Jake and Frank reached out to the local news station once again. The story was starting to gain national attention, and Jake knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for. The more Karen tried to intimidate him, the more it played into their hands. They had the truth, and now it was time to expose it to the world. The next day, Jake stood in front of his house, alongside Frank, as the reporter from the local station set up the camera. "Jake, today's interview is going to make or break this case," the reporter said, her voice serious but supportive. "We've seen the documents, and we know the corruption is real. But we need you to tell your story, to make sure the world knows what Karen and the HOA have done." Jake took a deep breath. He wasn't just fighting for his house anymore. He was fighting for the truth, for the entire neighborhood that had been kept silent for so long. "Karen and the HOA have been running a scam, plain and simple," Jake said into the camera, his voice calm but resolute. "She's been using her position to manipulate homeowners and profit off of them. I'm not just here for my property. I'm here for every single person who has been hurt by this corrupt system. It's time for the truth to come out." The reporter nodded and turned to the camera. "There you have it. Jake is standing up for what's right, and is asking the community to do the same. The HOA's practices have been under scrutiny for some time, but it's clear now that it's not just about one man's property. it's about justice for the entire neighborhood. The story aired that evening, and the backlash against Karen was immediate. The public outrage grew as more and more people started speaking out about their experiences with Karen and the HOA. Neighbors who had been too afraid to challenge Karen's authority were now emboldened by Jake's courage. They were ready to take their power back. The media storm surrounding the story had the desired effect. Karen's power was crumbling. She tried to fight back, calling a special HOA meeting to try to regain control. But it was clear she was losing. The community had woken up, and they were no longer afraid of her threats. The truth had spread too far, and it couldn't be buried anymore. Karen's last-ditch effort to intimidate Jake and the community fell flat. The more she tried to defend her actions, the more people saw through her lies. The HOA's power structure was collapsing, and Jake wasn't going to stop until Karen and the HOA were held accountable. Jake had won the first battle, but he knew there was still a long way to go. The fight wasn't over, but he had the momentum now. With the community behind him, the evidence in hand, and the truth on his side. Jake was ready for whatever came next. The final payback was just around the corner, and he wasn't going to stop until Karen's reign of terror was over for good. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Jake walked in, his pulse quickening. Today was the day. This was the final act in a long battle that had drained him emotionally, physically, and mentally, but Jake was resolute. He had spent months exposing the corruption within the HOA, and now it was time to make sure the person responsible for it, Karen, was held accountable. The evidence was stacked against her, and the truth was on his side. The media had covered his story, the community was rallying behind him, and the legal team had done everything they could. Now, it was up to the court to decide if Karen and the HOA would pay for their actions. Jake sat quietly in the front row, surrounded by his friends, family, and supporters from the neighborhood. The energy in the room was heavy, but there was a sense of unity among the people who had once been afraid to speak up against Karen's reign. It wasn't just about his house anymore. It was about the entire community that had suffered under her control. The courtroom was filled with the people who had come to support Jake and the truth, each one of them ready to see justice done. Karen, sitting across the room, looked as cold as ever. Her posture was stiff, and there was a tightness in her jaw as she sat beside her team of lawyers. She tried to appear confident, but Jake could see the tension in her eyes. Her empire was crumbling. She knew it, and she could feel the walls closing in. The community had turned on her, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. The judge entered the room, his stern expression setting the tone. Everyone stood as he took his seat, and the proceedings began. Frank, Jake's lawyer, was up first, presenting the case. Your Honor, what we're dealing with here is not just a dispute over property rights. This is about a system of manipulation, a clear abuse of power by the defendant, Karen, and the HOA she runs. Our client, Jake, was not just wronged in the sale of his property. He was deceived, lied to, and robbed of his family's legacy. This was not an isolated incident. This has been a pattern of behavior used by Karen to control the neighborhood and line her own pockets. Jake could feel the weight of the words. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone Karen had hurt. Frank's voice carried through the room, every word clear and calculated. The evidence they had presented, emails, contracts, testimonies from neighbors, was irrefutable. Karen had used her position for years to profit from the very people she was supposed to be protecting. Jake's heart raced as he listened to Frank's argument. He had trusted the HOA to protect the integrity of the community, but Karen had taken that trust and twisted it to her own advantage. The betrayal felt like a knife to the heart, but now, here in this courtroom, he was going to take back everything she had stolen. The gavel would come down, and this chapter would finally close. Karen's lawyer stood up to counter Frank's claims, but it was clear that they were struggling to find a way to defend the indefensible. Your Honor, we acknowledge that there were some discrepancies in the process, but this was not done with malicious intent, Karen's lawyer said, trying to sound persuasive. The HOA acted in what they believed was the best interest of the community. Jake's absence during his deployment left the HOA with no choice but to act. There was no ill will involved, and we ask that the court consider this before making any final judgment." Jake could see Karen's smirk from across the room, but he wasn't fazed. This was her last attempt to save herself, and it was failing. The more she tried to justify her actions, the more it became clear to everyone in the room that she had no valid defense. The HOA had abused its power, and Karen was the mastermind behind it all. The judge leaned forward, his fingers steepled together. "I've heard enough. I've reviewed the evidence, and it is clear that the actions of the HOA, under Karen's leadership, were not only unethical but illegal. The sale of Jake's property, the manipulation of the neighborhood rules, and the attempts to silence him, these actions are unacceptable. The court will rule in favor of Jake, and the HOA is ordered to reverse the sale of his property immediately." Jake's heart leapt in his chest. It was over. He had won. The truth had prevailed, and the years of hardship and frustration were finally coming to an end. He had gotten his land back, and Karen's reign of terror had come to a crashing halt. The judge continued, his voice steady. "Additionally, Karen is removed from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. The HOA will undergo an audit, and any further actions against Jake or any other homeowners who have been wronged will be investigated. The HOA will also be required to pay restitution for damages caused by their actions, and Karen will be held personally accountable for the harm she has caused." The room erupted in applause. Jake stood, feeling the weight of the victory wash over him. It wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for the entire neighborhood. The community had fought alongside him, and now they were free from Karen's grip. For the first time in months, Jake felt a sense of relief he hadn't even realized he was missing. Karen, sitting across from him, looked as if she had been slapped. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with disbelief. This wasn't how she had imagined this playing out. She had thought she could intimidate Jake, scare him into giving up. But Jake wasn't the kind of man to be intimidated. He had fought for his property, his family, and the truth, and now it had paid off. As the courtroom settled, Jake turned to Frank, who was smiling proudly. "We did it," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. Frank nodded, shaking his hand. "We did it. And you didn't give up, Jake. That's what made all the difference. This victory isn't just about reclaiming your house. It's about standing up to injustice and making sure that no one else has to go through what you've been through." Jake's mind raced with thoughts of the future. He had won, but there was still work to do. He needed to make sure that Karen's influence over the community was gone for good, that the HOA was restructured so it could no longer hurt people. The fight had been long, but Jake knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for the entire neighborhood. As Jake walked out of the courthouse, the sunlight hit his face, and he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The house was his again. The community was free. And Karen? She had been exposed for who she truly was. Jake had taken back his future, and with it, the hope for a better, fairer neighborhood.